So what is logic? Logic can be simply understood as the systematic study of the principles of correct reasoning. Now, in some of my lectures, I talk about reason, rationality. Now I'm talking about logic, but overall, I'm talking about critical thinking. And some of these terms you might get confused with because I seem to be using them interchangeably. I'm saying some of the same things about logic, reason, and critical thinking. Logic is the study of correct reasoning. You reason all the time, and I have a separate video where I discuss what reasoning amounts to. Reasoning is when we're drawing conclusions about the world, making inferences about the world, and logic is the study of how to do that correctly. One of the reasons people don't like the study of logic is because logic is what they call prescriptive. Logic tells us how we ought to think. It tells us how we ought to speak. It tells us how we ought to reason. And a lot of times people don't like being under the authority of a person, and they especially don't like being under the authority of some universal principles, universal morals, or universal laws. But that's just how it is. We cannot speak and understand each other without assuming the basic principles of logic. This is universal for everyone. And since logic tells us how we should be correctly reasoning, some people have an aversion to it. They're not trying to hear it. However, I think what you're going to see is that we can't get away from it. It's inescapable. All right. So look, if I said Brandon was late to class, Brandon is never late to class. Therefore, Brandon must have got a speeding ticket. This is something I tell my classes, in the prisons when I teach, right? Think about this. Brandon is late to class. Brandon is never late to class. Therefore, Brandon must have got a speeding ticket. None of you need to take a class in logic or philosophy or anything. You don't even need a college class to recognize that the conclusion doesn't follow. Just because I'm late to class and I'm never late to class means what? It could mean a lot of things. It could mean I had a car wreck. It could mean, I was sick. It could mean a lot of things. That third statement, the conclusion that I must have got a speeding ticket, it just doesn't logically follow. All of you recognize that immediately. You didn't need to take an expensive course in philosophy to know it because it's common sense. If I said, all men will one day die, Socrates is a man. Therefore, Socrates will one day die. All of you immediately recognize that third sentence, that conclusion, that's true. If the first two things are true, then the third one has to be true. If all men will one day die, in other words, all men are mortal, and Socrates is a man, then Socrates is going to die. Now, you may not know who Socrates is. He's an old guy from 2,500 years ago. I'll talk about him in a different video. But none of you needed an education in philosophy to understand that the first example I gave was obviously false. Just because I'm late to class doesn't mean I got a speeding ticket. And you also obviously recognize that the second one was true. Because Socrates is a man, he will one day die. And some of you are like, okay, I get it. Why are you going over this? This is kind of stupid. Well, it's not, because there are so many people in our world who do not want to accept the fact that there are basic rules of logic that our thought processes and our reasoning processes should abide by. So if you think that what I'm talking about is silly and you didn't need to hear it, then you haven't really engaged a lot of people in the world who have a lot of power and authority to make decisions over our lives. They don't believe these very basic common sense ideas. Your thoughts, your language, and your behavior generally follows rules of logic, and where it doesn't, it should. Where your reasoning process and your thinking is not being logical, you should correct it so that it is logical. Now, to be fair, I've heard lectures, I've read books where philosophers and other intellectuals try to refute what I'm actually saying. They try to make sense of statements like, you can't know anything for sure, or you shouldn't impose your morals on others. But when you listen to what they're saying, when you listen to those philosophers and intellectuals try to prove these statements do make sense, they have to go to great lengths to make that argument. They have to draw from very esoteric philosophy. They have to use a bunch of philosophical jargon that no one really understands in order to do it. What I'm saying is, the thing I'm trying to get across is that we all operate, our minds, our language, we all operate and think according to the laws of logic, and that is often what we call common sense. And in order to prove that what I'm saying is wrong or to refute me, a person has to go outside the bounds of common sense and logic in order to make those claims. Now, there are a number of objections to the things that I'm saying to why we ought to study logic, and I have a response to many of them. This is not the video where I will discuss all of those because I'm trying to make these actually short. For many of you, you think that's a joke because these are already too long, but I am trying to make these kind of short. I'll make a much more comprehensive series on logic. For now, I think the main reason that you ought to study logic is because it's unavoidable and it will enable you to be a better thinker.